So now you've had a little bit of a more in-depth view into how the EMA and the FDA are organized, what their remits are, and really some of the similarities and some of the differences in how they do their work. But actually, I think what you'll see as we get into now that a lot of what they do is really quite similar because it's based on a long agreement on what the fundamentals are when we get into new drug development. It doesn't matter whether you come to FDA or to EMA or if you go to both. The normal new drug development process that you see on this slide, and which I'm sure you're all quite familiar with, is the development process that is followed in both areas to develop the drug that goes into the marketing authorization application. In the United States, we call it an NDA, or a new drug application. In Europe, they call it the MAA, or the marketing authorization application. In the United States, as you'll remember from our last module, the FDA is responsible for overseeing clinical trials. And this is a bit of a difference than what we see in Europe, where it's the member states that are primarily responsible for overseeing clinical trials, as long as it's done in compliance with the European directive on clinical trials. In the United States, it's required that a manufacturer submit what's called an Investigational New Drug application before the first clinical study is undertaken in the U.S. This is really a regulatory vehicle under which all investigational trials are overseen in the U.S. When the IND first comes in it you would have all of the animal data. You would have any previous clinical data that might have been done outside the U.S. if any clinical trials had been done. It's not required that clinical trials have been done outside the U.S. And in fact, many first clinical trials of a new drug are performed in the U.S. There is in the IND the initial development plan so that the FDA understands what the manufacturer is foreseeing for this particular product. And in the IND, most importantly, is the first protocol with special emphasis on any safety concerns that might have arisen in any clinical trials that were done outside the U.S., and particularly any safety signals that might have come from the animal trials that were done prior to making the decision that the company believes that it's time to go into human clinical trials in the United States. Also, in the IND would be some initial information on how the company proposes to manufacture the clinical trial supplies. FDA knows at this point in time that the ultimate manufacturing process for most products has not been developed, that these are just clinical trials, but still wants to make sure that indeed the procedures that are used to make these particular products are indeed ones that would assure that the subjects and the patients in the clinical trials have the best quality clinical trial products possible. Now, in the IND, what the manufacturer is trying to do is to make the case to FDA that based on the totality of the data they have at that point in time and their ability to manufacture quality clinical trial supplies, that it would be appropriate to go into humans at this point in time in the U.S. And that they have put in place whatever kind of safety monitoring they believe they will need based on any of the information they have at that point in time. There's also another review that's happening either at the same time or sequentially to the FDA review, and that is the Ethics Committee review to make sure that indeed the protocol has been designed and is going to be conducted in a way that is consistent with the ethics laws in this country and the international ethics agreements on the use of subjects and patients in testing of drug products. In order to proceed in the United States, a company has to have been given a no objection by the FDA and has to be given approval by the appropriate institutional review board, which is what we call ethics committees here in the United States. When you look at the numbers of investigational new drugs that come into the FDA, these are just some approximate numbers. They vary obviously from year to year, but FDA gets around 450 to 550 commercial INDs per year, about 1,500 single investigator INDs per year, has around 13,000 to 14,000 currently active INDs, and is involved in about 5,000 reviews or actions each year on the INDs that it has. Now, the FDA has an interesting process that's a little bit different from most other countries when it comes to what happens when you submit the IND. In the United States, if it's the first submission of an IND, the manufacturer must wait 30 calendar days. If at the end of those 30 days they've heard nothing from FDA telling them that they may not proceed, they are perfectly free to proceed. You don't have to wait for an approval letter. In fact, you will not get an approval letter. But you have to wait the 30 days so that if FDA has an objection or has a question, it has time to review the information and to get back to the manufacturer and ask its question. Subsequent to this first submission to the IND, when it comes time to do the second trial or the third trial, all the manufacturer has to do is to submit the protocol and any new information, and once that is submitted, they are free to proceed. They don't have to wait for 30 days in order to start. And this is quite different than in most other countries where when you are applying to do a clinical trial, you generally have to wait and get an affirmative approval from the regulator before you begin your clinical trial. Now, if FDA has objections or has concerns about the clinical trial, it can place the whole trial or even a part of the trial on hold at any time, either in that initial 30-day period or any time while the clinical trial is being conducted, if it has certain kinds of concerns. If it believes the application is incomplete, for example, or if it doesn't believe that it's reasonably safe to proceed, if it believes the company has not instituted the appropriate safety monitoring based on the safety data that was presented in the IND, or if it believes that the trial design puts patients at risk for no scientific purpose. And this particular one is sometimes a bit nuanced in that FDA is looking at this from the perspective of assuring the safety of the patients and the subjects who have volunteered to be in the trial. If there is really no belief on the part of the FDA that information that will serve a scientific purpose will come from the trial, then clearly there's no reason to put subjects and patients at risks, and FDA could put it on clinical hold for that. Now, this is quite different than answering the question of does that clinical trial design actually ask and answer the question that the company wants answered in order to position this product as they wish to have it positioned in the medical armamentarium later on. That kind of discussion is one that can happen later with FDA, but it's not part of a reason that FDA would put an IND on hold. As I said, why does FDA do this, and why is this an important public health part of FDA's mission? As I've mentioned, I think clinical trials are about how FDA and the community initially learn about the safety and efficacy of new products. And I think as a larger community, we've come to believe that because patients and subjects are volunteering to participate in these kinds of trials, that there needs to be independent oversight to help assure that subjects and patients are not put at unreasonable risk and not put into trials from which we cannot reasonably expect to learn something scientifically relevant. Now, in this, you've heard me use the term patients and subjects. It's simply to introduce two different terms to you. Subjects are considered to be people who have volunteered to be in trials that do not have a disease. These would be people who would be in the early phase 1 trials, where you're simply trying to learn what the characteristics of the product are when the human body begins to metabolize it. So these are generally normal, healthy volunteers who are helping to answer the question of what does the human body do with and do to the drug when it goes into the human body. Patients, on the other hand, generally are volunteers who are in phase 2 and phase 3, when we have much more knowledge about the characteristics of the product, and we begin to treat people who actually have the underlying disease that people believe this particular product may treat. So when you hear the term subjects and you hear the term patients, that's really the difference. Now, as you can tell from our discussion about the IND, there's certain submissions that companies are required to send to FDA. You have to send in the IND. You have to send in the information required in an IND in order to legally conduct your trial in the United States. There are also meetings throughout the development and even after the development of a product that companies can have with FDA, but there are no required meetings. You can simply submit your IND, go off and develop your product, and come in with your NDA. Not generally the best way to develop a drug, but one that would at least meet the legal requirements. As I mentioned, though, there are a lot of meetings that companies do have with FDA, and in fact, there's some meetings that by the FDA regulations they're entitled to if the companies want them. And I think most people feel these are meetings that occur at really critical junctures in the development of a product, when it's critical that companies and the agency and that those involved in developing this product from a scientific perspective are in agreement on what the endpoints are, what the outcomes are, on the clinical trial design, on the statistical analysis, so that you will not have exposed patients needlessly to a trial that at the end of the day, unfortunately, does not tell us anything. Generally, these are meetings prior to submitting the IND to try to make sure that you have everything in there and that your IND will not be put on hold in that initial 30-day period. There are meetings at the end of phase 2 before you go into your large phase 3 trials, again to make sure that there is agreement on the design and the conduct of those trials. And then there's an entitled meeting prior to submitting your NDA, again to try to make sure that you have all the required pieces such that when you submit your NDA, FDA will indeed know that you have a complete NDA submission. Now, I think from the company's perspective, the reason that companies want to have meetings with FDA is that ultimately their goal is to get the marketing application authorized on one review cycle, to do your trials, to assemble your NDA, to submit your NDA, to have it reviewed, and then to have FDA come back with a long list of deficiencies is obviously not an efficient way to develop a product. So trying to have as much agreement on the various components prior to submitting the NDA is one way to try to make sure that you have answered all of the scientific and regulatory questions that need to be answered so that you can get an answer that doesn't have a long list of deficiencies at the end of the first review cycle. As I mentioned, FDA does interact with sponsors from the FDA perspective to help maximize the efficiency and the scientific robustness of these drug development programs, and to help assure that patients and subjects are not involved in trials that at the end of the day do not tell us something that is interpretable from from a scientific perspective. From the company's perspective, they are obviously trying to assure that there are no surprises at the end. And as I mentioned, from the public health perspective, we want to make sure that subjects and patients are in trials that will further our medical knowledge and that the trials are not designed or conducted in a way that is exploitative of those who have volunteered to participate.